Thank you for that introduction. I love that you recognize the native people of this land. In the country I'm from, the United States, we don't do enough to recognize those people who were here long before a lot of the people who live in America now came. So my name is Anwan Simmons. I want to thank everyone for coming here. I know that it's early, first session on day 2. Hopefully you had a good time last night. Thanks for coming early to come hear this talk. And I've always been a fan of leadership. And if you heard my talk yesterday, you probably got a sense of that. And I want to poll the audience. How many of you have a leadership role in the companies you work for? Okay. All right, thank you. How many of you may not have one, but you aspire to have one? All right, good. And I think I'll have some material for both groups. So I've been an engineering manager or technical leader for over 20 years, starting from my early days at Accenture and Deloitte, and I've also worked at a few startup companies. So I've been in the game for a while. And I know that being a technical leader, running software teams or serving software teams to be more exact, it's tough. It is a tough job. You have to keep people motivated. You're often doing stuff that no one's done before or figuring out new ways to do things that have been done before. And so it is a tough job. And I'm always looking for ways to improve. And I read a lot of books on leadership, not just in technology, but in general. I just read a book called How to Lead When You're Not in Charge. And I'm always trying to add to my library of books that help me understand how can I be better at this task of helping software engineering teams be successful. But I found that history is an underutilized tool in becoming a better leader. And I love history. I've always loved history, probably because I was like a D&D nerd growing up, and so that's got me interested in the Middle Ages and all that. And but a lot of people don't use history as a tool for becoming better leaders. I mean, after all, why study real history when you have fake history like Game of Thrones or Dungeons and Dragons? But I think that that's actually a loss because there's so many things that we can gain from history. And today we're going to talk about a technical leader from history who had a very tough project. And I think by learning more about this technical leader and learning more about the situation that he found himself in, we'll learn lessons that I think will help all of us become more effective leaders. Now, this technical leader was named John P. Parker. And he had a development team that was in trouble. So he was the lead developer for Project Phoenix, and the team's morale has sunken to extremely low levels. Someone had just left the team, and the initial technical leader that had started the project was no longer involved with the project. And despite a recent reduction in scope, the team was racing toward the finish line to get everything done in time. Does that feel familiar to anyone? You've all been there? And even though the finish line was almost literally in sight, Project Phoenix was in danger of failing to release into production. Now, John P. Parker was not a leader or a technical leader in the sense that we are. He didn't help software engineering teams build web applications or APIs using the internet. He operated on a different type of network called the Underground Railroad. Who has heard of the Underground Railroad? Okay, this is actually far more than I normally get when I ask that question. And this was a time period, the Underground Railroad operated in a time period during the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States. And this is actually a period when slavery, and this is something we don't like talking about, where the ability to own people was actually legally protected. I mean, strongly legally protected at the state and federal levels. But even though it's a tough period, there's so many great leadership lessons that we can take from this period in time. And I really believe that if we understand this period in history, we'll be better able to lead in the present. But this is hard history. It's something that you usually don't hear people at technology conferences talking about. And I know it's hard for many of us to even think about. But I really think that history is important to examine because the only way to keep it from happening again is to really interrogate what happened. And I think that part of living is understanding that life has a hard side. Life is not some Disney cartoon. There are bad things that happen. And history repeats itself, or at least as Mark Twain says, history rhymes with itself. And I think the only way to stop the repetitious disharmony that I know in the United States, at least, we have in our history, is to have a collective memory of the unpleasant aspects of history and build a collective resolve to resist the forces that often want to drag us back to that period in history. And I think that all of us, if we have the courage to lean into hard history, to take it head on, and to really look at it, then we'll get a better intuition for when things are going wrong, a better intuition for when there are things happening to things that I care about that I need to work and to protect. And I think that also one other benefit of studying hard history is that you'll get better at dealing with things that are unpleasant to look at. And often when things are unpleasant, what do? We procrastinate. We delay taking action because doing nothing always seems easier than doing something. But we have to be able to look at things that we don't like. I know that many of you work with code bases where there's stuff in there that you probably don't like. There's probably areas of the code base that you wish weren't there, and you may have spaghetti code going on, and you're like, oh, I know I need to refactor this. Or I know, one of actually my current dev lead said that it's a good day when he's deleting thousands of lines of code because the code that's the easiest to support is the code that you haven't written or the code that you unwrite because you know we really don't need this anymore. So we have to develop the resolve to understand there are times when we have to look at things that are hard, things that don't look good. Now, to understand John P. Parker and the leadership lessons that I really believe he has to share with us, we have to understand the Underground Railroad. And a lot of you have heard about it, that's great, but for those of you who have not, the Underground Railroad was not underground, and it also was not a railroad. It was underground in the sense that it was the secret network, and it had to operate in secrecy because you were basically fighting the federal government to get people from slavery to freedom. And it was a railroad because the people back then, they took terminology for what was considered high-tech back then. So the high-tech ride-sharing service of the 18th century was the railroad. And so these operators began to use railroad terminology to describe what they were doing. And this network operated from the slave states in the South, from my native state of Texas, all the way up into the free states on the upper right-hand corner of that picture. And you know, when I think about the operators of the Underground Railroad borrowing terminology from outside their field, that's exactly what we do today, right? We borrow terminology from outside our field to describe what we do. For example, if you work in Agile, you probably use Scrum. And Scrum came from a play in rugby, right, which is a sport. And sprints, well, that came from track and field. Now, I don't know if any of these sprinters write APIs or web services, but the thing that they do every day is used to describe what we do when we write code. So it's really interesting that we've, as an industry, borrowed terminology from the world of sports to understand how to build new technology. And so in the same way, the Underground Railroad borrowed terms from the rail system to describe their network. Now, what was the Underground Railroad? Well, it was a system. It was a network of paths and people that provided a way for enslaved people to move from the slave states to the free states. And actually, one of the off-ramps from the Underground Railroad was Canada. Because even if you were living in a free state like Pennsylvania or New York, there was always the risk that a slave catcher, and this was a profession back then, that a slave catcher could come find you and drag you back into slavery. And so to finally get rid of the threat of being enslaved, a lot of people came to Canada, or they went to the UK or to Mexico. And so this was a network where self-organizing teams who were operating in conditions of extreme uncertainty were tasked with shipping the most important product of all, and that's freedom. You know, in many ways, the Underground Railroad was a human-powered API, right? And so unlike the APIs of today, where we had these interfaces that let various clients talk to the system, the Underground Railroad was a set of interfaces that helped people come from slavery into freedom. So very similar to what we do today. Now, this is what the Underground Railroad was created to fight. The 1850 census in the United States, which was taken at the height of the operations of the Underground Railroad, listed 3.2 million people who were enslaved in America, right? 3.2 million people. And these are people who were born in slavery, had children who they had no hope that they would ever be anything other than slaves, and they went to their graves as slaves. And they were held against their will in a social and economic system that exploited and monetized their free labor. And in many ways, their so-called owners had total power over their lives, where they went, what they could do, and that power went from the Constitution to their local government. So it was the mission of the Underground Railroad to help as many of these people as possible escape to freedom. And John P. Parker was a conductor who was dedicated to this mission. So who is John P. Parker, and why are we talking about him? I learned a lot about John P. Parker in this book called His Promised Land, which I think is really great. It's a great book, but let me give you the Cliff Notes version. John P. Parker was born into slavery, but it didn't take him very long to hate the institution. When he was 8 years old, he was chained to an older slave, and he was forced to march from Norfolk, Virginia, to Mobile, Alabama. And if you're not from the States, that's about 100 miles. So I don't know what you were doing when you were 8. You probably weren't chained to an older person and forced to walk 100 miles. Now, in Alabama, he was sold to a doctor because he was a slave, so you could be bought and sold. And even though it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read, the doctor's sons decided to teach John P. Parker how to read and write. Now, Parker spent most of his teen years trying to unsuccessfully escape. He would escape, and he would get recaptured, and then Parker would try to escape again, and he would get recaptured. But he never had the opportunity to free himself by trying to escape. But over time, he learned a trade called metalworking, and this allowed him to make money. So slaves could, under certain conditions, make money. So by learning to do metalworking, and that's making things like doorknobs and hinges, that became his trade. And so by learning that trade, he could make money. And so he hired himself out to one of the doctor's patients and said, I'll work for you in exchange for my freedom. So by the age of 18, Parker had finally had enough money to buy his freedom. Now, Parker settled in Ripley, Ohio, and he started an iron foundry. So in many ways, he was a startup founder. And so this foundry actually was really successful. Parker was also an inventor and was one of the first black people in America to patent his designs. And he actually became one of the wealthiest men in Ohio during that time. Now, Parker found a career in Ohio, but he also found a cause. There was a very strong anti-slavery movement in Ripley, and Parker, almost by accident, became an agent of the Underground Railroad. So Parker changed from a very wealthy industrialist who lived a double life, right? So during the day, he ran his startup and serviced his customers, and then almost every night, he would take his boat across the Ohio River into slave territory, right? So he's risking his life in order to bring people from the slave state of Kentucky to the free state of Ohio. Now, I know this is kind of a weird concept, right? You're a wealthy person by day and a vigilante by night, or you're a wealthy industrialist who begins to try to, and you work with iron, but you decide to become a hero, right? I know that it's kind of a weird concept, but that's who Parker was. He risked his life for the benefits of humanity. And I really think that his early childhood trauma was what drove him to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And I know that many of you had different leadership journeys, and maybe something in your childhood, or maybe something in your early history drove you to become a technical leader. Well, Parker had the exact same journey. And so Parker eventually helped one, then two, then eventually hundreds of enslaved people get to freedom in Ohio. And he became really good at his job, or his calling, of being a conductor. But Project Phoenix was one of his toughest missions, and we're going to learn a lot of leadership lessons by talking about it. So Parker's involvement in Project Phoenix began like a lot of maybe you've gone through. It was a troubled project, and it began in central Kentucky, where there were 10 enslaved people with the initial technical leader involved in the project. And so they were in the heart of Kentucky. And so this group of people were trying to escape and journey through Kentucky, which was a slave state, to Ohio. So they were all trying to find freedom in the north. So they started a project, and they made it about 20 miles from the Ohio River when their leader was captured by slave hunters, right? And so as you might expect, this had a negative impact on the team's velocity. They basically came to a stop. And even though they were making a lot of progress, initially, they stopped making progress when their leader was captured. Now, this area is called the borderland. So let's zoom into the borderland. The borderland is the territory between Kentucky and Ohio, with the Ohio River flowing between them, right? So north, Ohio, freedom; south, Kentucky, West Virginia, slave territory. And the borderland was a area where almost every night an enslaved person tried to get across. They tried to cross through it because, being a slave sucked. It was just a horrible life. And so many people of color and with their wives and their children tried to escape. And almost every night, many of these people were captured, trying to go through the borderland. And so many people were captured. They were returned to their owners. Many of them were actually sold farther south because they were trying to get them away from freedom. And a lot of them were actually killed trying to get to freedom. And getting through the borderland would have been impossible without the Underground Railroad and people like Parker who risked their lives and even risked their own freedom to help other people find theirs. Now, the borderland was constantly patrolled by slave hunters, right? These people who would have bounties, and Parker eventually had a huge bounty on his head. And so these slave hunters would constantly patrol the borderland with their dogs, trying to find people. And there were often, since there were lots of rivers and bodies of water, any boats were usually locked to a tree. And then the oars were taken out because that would prevent an escaping person, an enslaved person, from getting the boat and taking across the river. So Parker actually went on to have a $1,000 bounty on his head. So this is in the 1850s. So $1,000 back then was a huge sum. And not only was it a huge sum, but it was dead or alive. So if you could prove that you killed Parker, you got $1,000. So let's zoom into Ripley because we really need to understand this area where Parker lived. So Ripley was on the other side of the Ohio River in Ohio. And so word of this group that was trying to escape eventually made it over to Ripley. And so it went to the house of Tom Collins, who was a station master, someone who basically ran a safe house in Ripley. And so Tom Collins learned about this troubled team that was stuck in the borderland. And so they went to Parker's house, And Parker decided, you know what, I'm going to go get this team. I'm going to save Project Phoenix and rescue them and bring them over to freedom. Now, these were rough times. And so Parker did what you do during this time, is that he took his 2 pistols and packed them in a large knife because he wanted to be prepared for emergencies, right? So it's just kind of a hard time. Now, I'm from Texas, and I'm also an American, so we love our guns, just to be honest. And I'm not saying that you should arm yourself with your teams. Don't come into your open space with weaponry. But Parker was a lead developer 107 years ago, and these were rough times. I mean, millions of people were living in slavery. But we'll see Parker's pistols again as we go through this story. So what I would encourage you to do is don't think of them as pistols, think of them as incentives, because that's the first leadership lesson that I want to share with you today. A good leader and a good leadership is always having incentives packed away for emergency purposes. Now, how do you incentivize software developers, right? And so this is going to vary from company to company and from team to team. But, you know, I like incentives that reward team performance, not individuals, but the entire team. But I also like to try to give the people on my team a reward or an incentive that's based on what's really the only truly non-renewable resource, and that's time. So here are a couple of my favorites. I know that usually many of you are working in sprints, and so there's a lot of work being put into getting a velocity and getting story points done. But I would try to give my team time to just choose a project of their own. And maybe we get a release out, and we have a little bit of time while we're grooming the backlog for the next release. I always try to give the team time to work on a project of their own choosing. And by doing that, you give them an opportunity to flex their interest, to pursue maybe a framework. Maybe you're an Angular house, but you have a few people who want to learn React. But give them time to choose a project that they can use on their own. Or provide funding for external training, right? Like books or going to a conference like this one. I like to have these incentives to give my team the ability to use their time for their own self-development. But the key thing is that you have to think about your incentives in advance, right? Don't wait until something bad happens to try to figure out, how am I going to reward my team? How am I going to incentivize them to get through this tough time? And it's really important to have what I call a portfolio of incentives, because one thing you'll learn is that people are different. There are some members of your team who will love to get off work early and go hit a bar and get drinks on the company, and that's great. And there are some people who will really like that. But maybe you have someone who's a single parent, and instead of going to a bar after work, they'd rather go home and let the babysitter who they're paying to watch their children off early and spend time with their kids. So maybe you offer, we're going to go get drinks, but if you don't want to do that, hey, we're taking walk off early. Here's an Amazon gift card for $50 for you to use for what you want to do. Offer a portfolio, right? Don't assume that everybody just wants to go drinking after work. Just assume that people are going to have different expectations, and that you have to structure your incentives along with their expectations. So you want to have a portfolio of incentives, but you're only going to be able to do that if you prepare them in advance, and if you know your team and what motivates each individual person. All right, so back to Parker. So Parker and another person took a boat across the Ohio River, and they entered into the borderland, right? So they're in slave territory now, and so now the tension begins to rise, because now every step they take is crucial. Because one mistake would mean that Parker would lose everything he's worked for, his business, his patents, maybe even his life, right? So he's in the borderland trying to help Project Phoenix get to freedom. And so because the timing of this activity happened where it was daylight, they went to a cabin and they had to basically stay there until nightfall. So when the sun set, Parker and his guide eventually found the Phoenix team, right? They eventually found them hiding in the borderland. Now, this team had been giving a lot of food because they had been giving a lot of provisions for the trip before they left. So they weren't hungry, but they were demoralized because their leader had just been lost, and so a lot of them were actually very, very afraid. And I don't know if you've worked with teams who have been afraid, and I know I have, but it's a situation where you often make bad decisions. Fear is not a good environment to make really good decisions. In fact, some of the people began to talk about, you know what, let's just give up. Let's just give ourselves up to these slave hunters and just go back into slavery. Now, Parker knew that he needed to take decisive action. So he says, look, let's get ready to move out. You know, we need to leave this location because y'all been here for way too long, and we need to begin moving toward the Ohio River. Well, one of the men in the group, one of the team members, began to get loud, and he began to complain. So what did Parker do? He used his incentive, right? He put out his pistol, and he said, look, you can come with us, or I can shoot you right now. And so this began, the man got quiet. So he stopped being a problem, and so Parker got that man under his control. And the rest of the group, seeing that, actually began responding to his actions, and they accepted his leadership. Now, let's translate this activity into the elegant weapons we have today in our more civilized age. And that's this. As a leader, there are times where you have to take bold action because bold actions set the tone. When you join a new team as their leader, if you have not worked with them before, those initial actions that you take are going to go a long way toward communicating to that team what kind of leader you are. And those initial assessments, they're going to persist for a very long time, right? As the cliche goes, first impressions are very hard to change. So you have to use those early days very well. Now, I've worked as a project manager and as a scrum master, and I've often walked into a new company and I've had to work with this team for the first time. So they've been working for a while, and often I'm hired to help improve their agile practices. And so there have been several times when I've walked in and into the daily stand-up the first day, and I've just gotten my badge and I know where the bathrooms are, and that's about it. And their daily stand-up is an hour-long meeting sitting around a table. And I'm like, okay, and I usually don't say anything because I'm like new guy, so I want to be careful what I say. But I realized that I needed to take bold action. And so the next day I got to the conference room early and I moved all the chairs out of the conference room into the hallway. And I just went inside and I just stood there. And then the first person walked in, they kind of looked kind of strange, and then what did they do? They just stood next to me, and so on and so forth. And we eventually got this daily stand-up into a 10-minute meeting that was rich in content. We created our plan for the day, and we were able to get going. And so that bold action set the tone for the rest of my time with that company. Now, I didn't have time to explain the theory, and I eventually did that. You know, the reason that we do stand-ups is because we want to create a quick plan for the day. For, you know, what we go over what happened since last stand-up, we go over what we think we're going to do today, and go over any blockers. So that lightweight plan helps us all have a mental model of where things are, and like that's the purpose of a stand-up. And I had to help them understand that, and being bold drove home that point. Now, Parker didn't have time to explain the theory, but his actions were effective. Now, Parker knew that the Phoenix team could not use any of the roads because those were always patrolled by slave hunters. So he began leading his team through all the thick woods of the borderland. So they began to make their way, and it's hard and exhausting because I don't know if you ever walked through woods, but it's tough because, you know, there are twigs that are pulling your clothing, and often you have the snap of branches, and a lot of this was really tough going. But there was then a problem, right? So Parker was an experienced woods person. He had helped a lot of enslaved people go through the borderlands. But Project Phoenix, this was really their first time. And so they're trying to move quietly through this bush, but they're making a lot of noise. And they know they're making a lot of noise. And so they began to make a lot of noise as they went through the borderland. And that's not a good experience for people who were trying to avoid being detected by slave hunters. And so the team began to get a little bit demoralized again. Now, when you think about this, right, Parker was leading a team that was stumbling through thick woods. And some of you may have been through this before, right? The Phoenix team was basically drowning in the 19th century version of JavaScript, right? Going through, slogging through, trying to get things going. But that leads us to our next leadership lesson. And that's don't let your experience bias you. You know, many of you lead teams or work in companies where you have a lot of say. You have a lot of control over what the team does, whether they do Agile or something else. They're doing Agile, whether you do Kanban or Scrum or something else. You even maybe have control over the technical stack that the company's going to use. And you know, you have to understand that you can't let your preferences drive what you do for your team. You know, you may have a lot of experience in React, but you know what? Angular may be a better fit for what the team is trying to get done. Or you may love AWS, but Google Cloud Platform may actually better align with this project's requirements. So don't let your preferences blind you to what's best for your team. You have to change from aligning with your expertise to aligning with what's best for the environment that the team is working on. And that's the way you help teams flourish. So that's what Parker did, right? So he found that leading them through the ravines that were covered in moss and ferns was better. They could move in quietness and move in stealth and actually make a lot of progress. So by doing that, Parker eventually converted his team from JavaScript to TypeScript, which some of you have gone through before. And so this team began to get joyful because they're like, okay, we can do this. We can do this escaping from slavery thing. And so they began to move through the borderland. But then there was another problem. So one of the people on the team got thirsty because they were making progress, but it was hard work. And so he decided to find water, to try to find some spring to find water. Now Parker said, no, stay with the group. No, you need to stay with us because we're safer in a collective. But this man insisted on meeting his own need. So this thirsty guy, and some of you know about dealing with thirsty men, so this thirsty guy left the team and went off on his own. And so Parker says, you know what, we have to keep going. So they began to move forward. But then what happened just a few minutes later, they hear this guy yell out, and he's racing through the brush. And they saw him being pursued by two slave hunters, right? So they're far enough away where the slave hunters can't see them, but they can see this person being chased. So Parker made the team lie down and hide in the woods so that they wouldn't be found. And so this thirsty guy probably forgot where the team was because he ran right by them. And so the team sees them disappear into the brush. Then they hear a gunshot. So the team gets really, really quiet. So Project Phoenix, they begin to go through fear again. And so Parker looks at his team, and he realizes that some of them are probably going to cry out, or they may actually jump up and go running after this guy. And so he realizes that if any of the Project Phoenix team members do this, that's going to jeopardize everyone. So what did Parker do? He turned to his incentives. He pulled his pistol out again, and he just said, look, I'm going to shoot the first person who makes a sound, which calmed the team down. And so you might think, man, Parker's kind of quick with these pistols, right? I mean, he's kind of pulling them a lot. And some of you may remember that Parker used his pistols before to solve a similar drop in morale. So it was a similar problem, and he used a similar solution. And that's the next lesson. You have to embrace continuous solving. You have to embrace continuous solving. I know a lot of leaders get surprised when they see problems happen again, Because many of you are highly motivated, maybe type A personalities, so you're used to solving hard problems and you want to solve it forever. That's not how life works. You're going to solve a problem, you're going to see it again. You have to embrace continuous problems because most of the problems that we deal with as leaders are chronic. They're built into the fabric of the organizations that we work for. They're built into the fabric of the teams that we're trying to lead. And so often the technology is easy. Technology is the easy part. It's the people. That's the hard part. That's the real, that really tests the mettle of leaders. And you know what? Teams are like code bases. Teams are always changing. The technology may change, or the leadership may change, or the competition may change. And it's like code, a change could break something that you thought was working. And that's why we do regression testing, right? That's why we try to have good test coverage to detect those changes early and try to resolve them. I mentioned that I had to fix a stand-up at a company, and I found that fixing the stand-up is just one symptom of a problem, and that's usually horrible meeting culture. I don't know, maybe you all run meetings really well where you work, but meeting culture where I've worked is horrible. People tend to not know when to leave the meeting. People don't know when the meeting's over. All right, we're done here, everyone. Go back to work. And so when I fixed the stand-up, I had to fix other aspects of the meeting culture. So I have to embrace continuous solving because those upstream problems that force the downstream problems that I deal with to become problems, that's what I had to figure out. What are these upstream problems? And I had to figure out how to solve them. And the sad fact is that problems don't die. Only people do. So be kind to your people and work with them to solve your problems. Now, the good news is that if you have your incentives prepared in advance, and you have tools for continuous solving. So keep your portfolio well stocked. So now the Phoenix team, they hear rustling in the brush, and they see this thirsty guy being led with the rope around his neck by two men, by these two slave hunters. And so Parker realized that, wow, they just narrowly escaped being captured. But he also knows that the captured guy, the thirsty guy, may confess that he wasn't going through the borderland alone, and he may tell the slave hunters about the Project Phoenix team. So he decides to get them as far from that spot as possible. And so they come to a road, but this is a very well-traveled road, and they realize that they have to lay down in the woods until nightfall. So after dark, they cross the road, and they begin to make that last lap toward freedom. And so they see the Ohio River, right? So to an enslaved person, the Ohio River is freedom. So Parker and his team, they could literally see, because it's nightfall, the lights of Ripley across the river. It was like freedom shining in the night. And so they began to anxiously kind of make their way toward the Ohio River. But then suddenly, the team encounters a patrol person. Now, this patrol person sees the large size of this group, and he runs off. And so the team finally made it to the riverbank, but there's one problem. Tom Collins didn't know that Parker would have his team work at nighttime. And so Parker got to the Ohio River way before he was supposed to. And so, this is almost like you're working over the weekend and you're trying to check in your code and you realize that they took the build server offline. Kind of like that. And so he realized that they have to wait until there's a better time to begin to go across the river. So now we're back to where we started the story, right? The team was scared. Their first leader was gone. They had just lost a team member. Project Phoenix was demoralized. And so even though they were really trying to get to freedom, they were trying to get this release out, failure was imminent. Now they began to look for a boat on the shore, and so someone finds a boat, but there aren't any oars to power the boat. And so Parker has them begin to kind of stomp through the grass, and then, because they're looking for oars, but then they hear the barking of dogs. So that patrol person must have been a C++ developer because he ran really fast. So Parker leaps into the boat. He tries to get and he tries to tear out a seat to use it as a makeshift oar, but then he finds it. He realized that the oars are actually in the boat. He couldn't see because it was so dark. So they hear the pursuers, and Tarker says, everyone get into this boat, but then there's another problem. The boat could only carry 9 members of the 10-person team that was Project Phoenix. And so 9 people are in the boat, 1 person is on the shore. And so one of the women that was in the boat began to cry out because the person on the shore was her husband, right? And so she's beginning to cry out because she doesn't want to leave her husband. But that leads us to our final leadership lesson for today. You're a leader of leaders. You know, we often think as leaders that we have to solve everything, but we won't be able to solve everything. And there are often capable people on our team that if we trust them, could also help us. Even though we may have boldness and experience and incentives and technical skills, we can't solve everything. So you're not the only leader on your team. You may have the title, but you have to trust the members of your team to lead when necessary. And you know, often we think, you know, I alone can fix it. We think that we're the key to the kingdom. We're the key to getting our team to success. But that's a myth, right? You know, we use solutions every day that we didn't invent, right? Did you invent language? Did you invent English or French? Did you invent reading or writing? Did you invent the clothes that you're wearing right now? I mean, maybe some of you made your own clothing, but most people don't, right? We use things that we didn't make. And so we have to be able to work with our team to use what they bring to the table to help lead our team. So one of the single men on the boat quietly got out of the boat and walked to shore and let the husband on the shore get into the boat with his wife. And so Parker began rowing across the river with his team, right? And I've been in situations where I couldn't solve it. And so this person for Parker solved this problem that Parker could not solve. And so many times in my career, I've been so lucky to have my team members step up and lead when I didn't even have the time or I didn't have the ability to focus on that problem and solve it for me. So Parker looks back and he sees the man standing on the riverbank, and he eventually sees the lights of lanterns surround him as that man is eventually recaptured. So Parker takes his team to Tom Collins' house, and who's actually surprised to see him because he got there so early. He got him to another lead developer, and Parker completed his release. He helped these people get released into freedom, but he never saw them again. And Parker was one of many former slaves who risked his own freedom to get people over to freedom via the Underground Railroad. And I know that many of us won't take the risk that Parker did, but I really hope that you learn from Parker and that you have the courage to do what he did. You know, it wasn't in Parker's job description to help enslaved people get to freedom, but he did it because he felt that it was right. And it's not in many of your job descriptions to help our industry, which is often toxic to women, people of color, LGBTQ people, people who are handicapped. It's not in your job description to help them, but you should do it because it's right. And I really hope that many of you look at your own history. There was a time when I thought that my own history, because I'm the descendant of slaves, my ancestors came across on boats to work for free. And I didn't think that my personal history would help me in my job, but I realized that these people resisted. These people fought hard. Many of them risked their lives to help their fellow enslaved people. And that encourages me. And you know, I'm often in meetings that are like multi-million-dollar meetings where a lot's on the line. And when I'm in those meetings, a little bit of the Underground Railroad is in those meetings too. Because it informs how I lead, the kind of person that I am, how I treat and value my people. That's a leader that I've tried to be based on who John P. Parker is. So I hope that all of you, no matter your background, maybe you didn't go to MIT or some fancy technical school, or maybe you don't work for Facebook or Google or some impressive company, but I hope that you will look into your history, look into your background, and find tools and techniques to help you be a better leader. And I think that the Underground Railroad is a great place to start. All right, that's my time. Thank you. All right, I think I'm over time. Yeah, okay, I gotta go. Thank you, everyone. Take care.